First of all, Rick, let me say thank you, and both of you and Mr. Dart for coming today. And I don't think I've ever had a public setting in a congressional setting where I can thank you for the work on the Idaho roadless rule. I said it and I mean it that I believed you worked in good faith on it. As you recall, we had a little trouble getting started, but once we got started, we worked in good faith on it, and I found the Idaho Conservation League and you personally to be very reasonable in the final product that we developed, and it's a product that I think Idahoans can be justly proud of, including yourself, including your organization. So thank you for that work on behalf of all Idahoans, actually. I've got a couple of questions. Number one, Mr. Dart, and you recall, you and I talked about this recently, and I told you, I am not familiar with the details of this because I wasn't engaged in the give and take on it, but I assume you were, along with Congressman Simpson. And Rick, could you respond to, and I told you I was much more concerned about the process and how we get to the goal line than I am about the details of it, because you guys have got to hammer that out. But could you respond to Mr. Dart's statements about how he made reference to the fact that, as I understood him correctly, that after the collaboration occurred, there's been some stripping out, I think was his words, that occurred. Could you respond to that?
Certainly. When we are working in any collaborative manner, and I think the Oahe Canyonlands bill is a good example of this, you have two different arenas where you have to work. One is, and as you alluded to earlier, in the past, some of these processes have been top-down. But if you're going from the bottom up, you obviously start in the home turf. You sit around with Idahoans and you create Idaho solutions, and you come up with your ideas of what you think would be best for representing all the different interests. There were a bunch of things that I wanted to get in there. There were a bunch of things that motorized folks wanted, large conveyances of public land that were once being talked about as great as 16,000 acres. So Idaho interests came up with the Idaho solution as we saw it. The Idaho Conservation League was willing to support that. In earlier drafts of the bill, I've sat at this very table to do that. But there is ultimately the second arena that you have to work, and that is here. That is Washington, D.C. That is the arena of Congress. And in the Oahe lesson, what we had was a package of items that were brought here to Washington, D.C., and many of those things also fell out. And many of those things did not survive in the final legislation. And what did come back to Idaho is an understanding of what was possible. As they often say, politics is the art of the possible. So we did the best job in the Oahe that we could do. But some things don't stand the heat of the cauldron back here. But what we did have were handshakes, agreements, how we would look to the future of management in Oahe County, and we're going to stick with those. I think that there's opportunity to create some of the handshakes and agreements here, but there are certain pieces of the bill that were created in Idaho that frankly didn't stand back here. And I think it's important. It's an indication that we have the hearing today that is an indication there was bipartisan involvement in this bill, and I think that it would not have been scheduled for this hearing were not some elements of the bipartisan process in play.
Thank you. Last question, Mr. Chairman. Rick, the three areas that are here that have been designated for wilderness, Hemingway Boulders, White Clouds, and Jerry Peak. Those three are three areas that in the roadless rule, when you and I worked on that we designated for what is essentially wilderness designation, although we called it wildland recreation in order to designate it as such. What does this bill do as far as changing the designation or the protection or what have you for those three areas compared to what it is in the roadless rule? And as I recall, we had 280 areas, and it's hard to remember each one of them, but as I recall, I think virtually everyone agreed that these three areas were pristine areas, some of the finest in the country, and no one really questioned the judgment that they should be protected as was done in the roadless rule. Does this bill change that at all?
I think one of the key things that's important to recognize about that very question, Senator, is that wilderness is something different. Wilderness is the highest standard that we can provide to protection of land in this country, and for that reason, the founders of the Wilderness Act and this body right here determined that that was not something to be left in the discretion of the management agencies. The roadless rule that you have alluded to that we worked on together was a process that informed and ultimately helped provide direction to an agency decision. But that is an agency decision that can be overturned by different agency leadership, different administration, what have you. Wilderness obviously could be overturned too, but it takes an act of Congress. So our issue with what makes it different is that wilderness is really the gold standard to protect a landscape. As you have already alluded to, as many people have, the Boulder White Clouds are an extraordinary place, an extraordinary example of why the Wilderness Act was written. It was an extraordinary example of why the Sawtooth NRA was originally passed in 1972, and there are a number of reasons why the Boulder White Clouds were not included at that time. But the long and short of it is no one ever debated whether or not that area should receive the protection, and I believe that one reason.
Well, I appreciate the discussion about difference between the rule and the statutory, and I agree with you from an absolute legal standpoint. You're absolutely correct. From a practical standpoint, you and I both know that before they overturn the rule that we worked on, it's going to be over our collective dead bodies, and I suspect over most Idahoans. But the specific question I had was the details of what is done in this bill. As you recall, in the roadless, Chris Wood, who had written the Clinton roadless rule, agreed that what we had done in our protection of these areas was a higher level of protection than actually the Clinton wilderness or Clinton roadless rule did. Does this ratchet it up more? Does it keep it the same? What is the level of protection?
The Idaho roadless rule does not address the issues related to motorized recreation. Wilderness designation would do that. And I think in the state that is the 6th fastest growing state in the country right now, we need to recognize the greatest places that we have for future generations, protect those for a variety of different reasons. While wilderness designation addresses the issue of mechanized and motorized use proactively and prohibits it, the work that we did to exclude trails and design boundaries to protect motorized access, I think, quite fairly deals with that issue. But the most significant threat to this area over the long term, which is up to administrative decisions in the future, is motorized recreation.
Thank you very much.